This is the second part of compounds and phrases, which is a little bit more theoretical. We're going to talk about the differences between sentence formation and word formation to show that compounds and phrases are different and try to find the boundary of where morphology and syntax is and realize that a boundary is not so clear cut. So the first question we're going to tackle is, do the principles of sentence formation also apply to word formation? And the first piece of evidence we're going to look at are with heads. So are heads in morphology the same as heads in syntax? And when you take a look at compound words like police officer, where officer is the head and police is describing the type of officer, we see that in the syntax, if we think about a parallel way to express the same meaning, we can do this description like officer for the police, where the head is still being modified by what's called a dependent. So basically the thing that's not the head that's giving more information. But if we take a look at, say, derivational compounds, we don't get this nice parallel between the syntax and morphology here. So if we have something like government, so we have a verb head taking a dependent, which would be an affix, we can't paraphrase this into something like govern that is for the ment, or some way to separate the meanings of govern and ment like we could with police officer. We can't do this. So it looks like morphological heads and syntactic heads are different, at the very least, and we're not quite sure what's happening yet with the compounds because it looks like it can do something syntactic, so there is some different behavior between compounds and derivationally derived words, at least. So what other similarities or differences are there? So in syntax, we say that the heads determine the inflections. So they don't determine the inflections, they have the inflections on them. So in Japanese, you'd have a verb root like tabe for eat, and you'd have something like the potential and the polite present or the question marker all attaching to the head. And it looks this way in morphology too. So we could describe this syntactically or morphologically for word creation. Now, in syntax, we know that the head is also determining its subcategories. So, for example, if I want to say, I gave X to Y, we know what type of phrases X and Y have to be. They have to be noun phrases. And specifically with gave, we know it's ditransitive. It needs two objects. It needs a direct object and an indirect object. So we're saying that gave, the head of the verb phrase, is selecting its subcategories. It selects what it wants. So, for example, want, you can say I want pie, which is an NP, or I want to leave, which is another clause. So we assume that the same thing happens in morphology. The head is selecting its dependents. Like a noun, like dog, is selecting for the plural suffix or the possessive marker. But what if we make the argument that it's not the heads that are selecting? Sorry. We're going to make the argument that, yes, it is the heads selecting the dependents, but it's not the lexeme, it's not the root selecting the affix, but rather it's the affix selecting the root. So what if the affix is actually the head? And what evidence do we have for this? Well, if we think about an ly adjective, so something like humanly or womanly, most ly adjectives are derived from human nouns, so words like humanly and grocerly, but not all of them allow this ly suffix. So we don't get words like grocerly or lecturerly or pilotly. Those are not adjectives that we use in English. But when we do make up new words with ly as an adjective, like he did it very... Sorry, that doesn't really work. He was a I guess he was a manly person. He was a childly person. Childly, again, is used too. It's not quite new, of course. It's hard to make up a new word. But most of these new words that we create tend to attach to human nouns. So it seems like it's not that nouns are saying, I want ly to become an adjective. What it sounds like is that ly is saying, I want a human noun, and if I get that, then I'm going to become an adjective. So it seems like it's better to say that affixes are selecting their bases. So that would mean then that affixes, so let me just point this out, affixes should be heads. Okay, so this is the first conclusion we're getting, is that what if we say that affixes should be heads because it looks like affixes are selecting the bases that they want. Okay, so now think about syntax. If we have two forms of a sentence, let's say we have we have a noun phrase and we have a V and an NP. So we know in syntax what this little black box should be, but imagine we don't know. And we have another sentence frame where we could have NP and V. But let's say it has to be one of these two types. Well, the argument is that whatever has to be there is what's going to head that phrase. So in both cases, we need a verb, so we get a verb phrase. And this point is basically head determines the phrase type. Okay, so this is what syntax says. Now, if we think about applying this to morphology, saying are morphological heads the same thing as syntactic heads, then in morphology, we would say that the head of the compound, of course, is going to be determining the characteristics of the larger construction. It might not even be the compound, it might just be the complex word. And we'll see what happens here. So imagine we have a word like happy. Well, this is obviously the head of its own word, because it's just one morpheme, happy. But then if we have a new word like happily, well, happy is going to be the head of its own little word there, just the adjective. But with happily, if we're saying now that the affixes are choosing the bases, then what we're saying is that this ly is actually the head, if affixes are choosing bases. That would be the head. And because the head is determining the overall category of the constituent, the larger one, that means that the word happily, being an adverb, implies that the ly affix also has a word category. So what we've shown here, and you might have to rewatch this, or go back if you're missing one of these points, is that if we assume that morphological heads and syntactic heads are the same, we end up in a situation where affixes are heads and they get their own word categories. Now, this is a problem because if we say that ly, the suffix, is an adverb, it should behave like an adverb. But you cannot just strand the ly suffix at the beginning of a sentence or at the end of a sentence on its own like you can with adverbs, because you can't just leave that suffix stranded on its own. So if we assume that the two heads are the same, that morphology and syntax and word formation and sentence formation is exactly the same process, we end up with this analysis that we do not like. So because of that, we can say that, okay, sentence and word formation are different processes. So compounds, we don't have to assume they're the same as phrases. We can say that these are separate things that have separate processes and have separate properties. So when we take a look at compounds versus phrases, we can first think about meanings, like he is a dishwasher versus he washes dishes. So dishwasher is a compound and washes dishes, of course, is just two words. And both have similar meanings, but they are different. Of course, he is a dishwasher. This is attributing a property to the person you're talking about. And he washes dishes. Of course, this would be like a habitual action. So these are basically two ways of saying very similar things, but when you say he is a dishwasher, of course, this implies a job title rather than washes dishes as a job action. Okay, what about these words? I work in a greenhouse. So this is a house that is green. Let's give it a window. And I work in a greenhouse. So this is the large open place, I guess it's covered with plastic, where there's like plants and wildlife in there. That's a flower. Okay. So two different types of houses here. In a greenhouse, you have the adjective green describing house. And you'll have a stress difference. I have a greenhouse. Well, you have a blue house. I have a greenhouse. Well, I work in a greenhouse. 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 I work in a greenhouse. We see a difference in stress with these two. So that's one of the main differences that we can hear. We also have a meaning difference. In the phrase, green is taken literally. In the compound, green is taken figuratively, so non-literally. Okay, so let's figure out some tests that we can use to distinguish between compounds and phrases. The first one is separability. So a word can't be separated essentially, and compounds are just words. So if math teacher is a compound, we assume it's a word, so we shouldn't be able to separate it. So we can't put like an adjective in between. So the math known for making hot dogs teacher. This sounds horrible. And this tells us that math teacher is a unit. But the old teacher, so old and teacher, we're saying these are separate words. We can separate them. The old, known for making hot dogs teacher, blah, blah, blah. So this works. So because we can separate it, we know they're different word categories. Now in compounds, when we do a coordinated compound, so say greenhouse and White House, and we should really remove the space here. So pretend there's no space in greenhouse and White House here, just for clarity. So we're talking about the building with the plant inside. That's what we're talking about. When we do one replacement with the head noun, we don't retain that metaphorical figurative meaning. So the greenhouse and White House both have staffing issues. These are the greenhouse where you have plants and White House where the president works. So if we change White House and we take house and we replace it with the word one, we lose that American presidential meaning. The greenhouse and white one both have staffing issues. The greenhouse and white one both have staffing issues. When you do that, you now think of color. So it becomes its literal meaning. So with compounds, if you do one replacement, you lose that figurative meaning and you go back to a literal one, if it's even grammatical at all. In terms of meaning, there are differences as well. So in compounds, you tend to have generic meanings. So if you talk about a history teacher, it's about generic history. A dishwasher is just about washing dishes in general. It's not about specific dishes or specific periods of time. So here we have a case where we have I eat the flesh. So this is a phrase, and I eat flesh, which is a compound. In the first one, a phrase, which I'll just call A here, we get a specific meaning, I eat the flesh. So this is specific flesh. And we see in our compound, I eat flesh, this is no longer specific flesh, this is just I eat flesh in general. So we have a more generic meaning in our compound. And that's a trend across all languages. There's differences in stress, of course, that we talked about. So blackboard versus a blackboard, greenhouse versus a greenhouse. So you can see where the primary stress is located. The thing is that with nouns, primary stress is not on the second syllable, not on that head. And then with our phrases, our noun phrases here, we have stress on that noun. So a blackboard, a green house. Now, not only does this happen in English, but this happens in other languages. So it happens in Mandarin as well. And we had people in class say that they didn't hear it, and that's not something that happens. But believe me, it does. Maybe not in all dialects, but this does happen. So Mandarin is both tonal and stressed. So if you take a look at the noun paper cut versus the verb phrase to cut paper, there is a stress difference between the two, even though the tones are the same. And this happens with the noun fried rice and the verb phrase fry the rice as well. In some languages, there's this really interesting process called vowel harmony, or at least this property called vowel harmony. And this just, the specific vowels involved depend on the language, but here's what vowel harmony is. So in Chukchi, there is like two sets of vowels. There's E, A, and U. So you can kind of think of like in the vowel chart, I just draw out in the part of the mouth. There's like this first bit up here is group 1, and then the rest of the vowels are down here in group 2. So I'll just write where the numbers correspond to here. So when you're in a compound, all of the vowels in your compound have to come from group 1 or group 2. So for example, in metal net here, this is a compound. All of the vowels in this word come from group 2. You could have a compound that all come from group 1. So if you're in a compound, the word must exhibit vowel harmony. So those vowels together form their own harmony, you could say. Now in a non-compound, so just a regular word like net or in a phrase, we see O is coming from group 2, but a second vowel is coming from group 1, so you can have a mix here. So it is only the compounds that need to show vowel harmony, where all the vowels in a word come from the same set. And you can even see here, for net to metal net, it's the same word, that A has been changed to ah, just so it can follow that pattern. Of course, not all languages have this, so this isn't a test you can use in every language. The last one happens to do with morphological patterns, just for how processes apply to words. So the idea is that a morphological process applies to a word and not to part of a word. So if we have a phrase like sister-in-laws and we're adding a plural s to it, well, making something plural has to apply to a whole word. So it has to apply to the entirety of sister-in-laws. Maybe it's just laws, but we know that this S is not talking about law. It has nothing to do with the meaning of law. The meaning comes from sister. So the sister in that case must be the head, and this is some exceptional compound. Well, at least it's not, sorry, I shouldn't say it's exceptional. I should say at least it's not endocentric with a right head like we're used to seeing. Sisters-in-law, on the other hand, is an interesting case because maybe this isn't a compound, maybe this is a phrase, and there's a possibility that this is a phrase. You can analyze it both ways. And that's because we could assume that sister is a word where the process of plurality applied after that, and then in-law was attached. So it could be sisters was the word n, that becomes the noun, and then this is a noun phrase that's taking another prepositional phrase to describe it. That could be what's happening. Or it is a compound, so you have sister-in-laws, but it just happens that the S doesn't appear at the end of the word. It's a word internal change. So that's something we can see in English, but in general, morphological processes apply to an already formed word. So these are trends across languages to help us differentiate between whether something is a compound or a phrase. The best test, of course, is separability. If you know meaning, you can check to see whether your phrase or compound is generic or specific. With compounds and phrases, you can check to see if it's been applied to an entire word beforehand or not, if it's just been applied to like one part inside a phrase, like sisters-in-law. If you have sisters-in-law, well, it's word internal, so you could have a phrase there. And depending on the language, you might have differing suprasegmental patterns like in stress or vowel harmony, or different phonological processes happen to compounds but not phrases. So that's it for compounds versus phrases in terms of, whether syntax is different than morphology. Now, the last bit we'll talk about are clitics and, well, a little bit on lexical integrity. So a clitic is basically a contracted form. So if we have a sentence like I am going to leave, we can take am and reduce it to apostrophe m, I'm going to leave. So you can see it's not like a full word. It's what's called a weak form. It depends on another form to exist. So cannot exist on its own. It has to rely on another word, which is why, in a way, it behaves like an affix. Now, not all words can do this. So do you have the time? We can't reduce it to do you have the time, unless maybe you're speaking some sort of European variation of English. Now, a simple clitic appears in the same spot that a word does in its free form. So in this case, like I am going to leave, we can just replace it with I'm right in the same spot. But not all clitics behave like that. But what we're focusing on are simple clitics. So here's a few properties of clitics that make them special. Clitics don't always have to attach to the same category. So they're not as picky as normal affixes. So the show I'm watching's main character, that store I walked by's poster, my kid's doll, each of these attach to a different word category. Now we know in syntax that this is really like it's becoming a whole phrase attaching to a phrase here. But if we just take a look at the immediate word that it's forming a new constituent with, so watchings, by's, kids, we see it attaches to different categories. Clitics also won't show lexically conditioned allomorphy, so like with children, oxen, women versus woman, we see special cases here where it's not just a plural s. But when we have clitics, we'll never see this happen due to lexical conditioning. Sure, we'll see for the apostrophe s, watchings, kids, cats, it'll go between s and z, so s and z, but it will never change just according to the word. It will be phonologically or grammatically conditioned. Clitics can also attach to words that contain other clitics. So I would have come can be I'd have come, or I won't have come can be shortened to I won't have come. But it doesn't work the other way around. So you can't attach an affix to something that already has a clitic on it. So the guy who jumped's picture is fine because this is affix and clitic after, but in the case where we have the guy who jumps picture, well, first we have our clitic and then we have our affix, which is not good. So clitics cannot do that. They attach basically after everything else has already been attached, or another clitic. So the presentation in class was on Zwicky and Polum, whether the clitic nt is an inflection or a clitic. I just said it was a clitic, sorry, whether the string nt is a clitic or an inflection. And even though it looks like a clitic with an apostrophe, it's actually an inflection. On Canvas and modules, the presentation is there with the question and solution. I suggest looking through it. But a lot of the same criteria is in the slides already, but the criteria are nicely listed out in the presentation with examples, so please check it out for the homework question. The last thing we'll talk about is lexical integrity, and we won't spend too much time on this, but the idea of lexical integrity basically tells us what are words and what are not, by taking a look at, again, the differences between morphology and syntax. So the idea is that morphological rules apply to morphemes, and then syntactic rules apply to full words. So the syntax does not look into a word and do things. That's what the morphology does. So it used to be that we think there was like this assembly line where we take a word or some underlying form, go through rules of morphology, rules of syntax, rules of phonology, and then you get this surface form, surface representation that you speak. But now we think that these happen in parallel. But regardless, with lexical integrity hypothesis, the syntax does not go into a word. So what this means for us in English is, in a case of, say, phrasal verbs, where we have these forms like wrote down information, or to wake up, or to doze off. With these phrasal verbs, are these something like compounds, where it's just one word, or is it a phrase, where they're actually two words? And we can use lexical integrity to check for this. So syntax, according to lexical integrity, cannot affect words. So it cannot affect the internal structure of words. So if wrote down, for example, this phrasal verb, is one unit, one word, then we shouldn't be able to move part of it. So we shouldn't be able to take, say, wrote and move it, or we shouldn't be able to take down and move it, or we shouldn't be able to take something else and move it in between. It should be one unit. But if it's not a word, if it's not one single word and instead two separate words, then the syntax could operate on both of them independently. And what we see with phrasal verbs, with transitive ones and ditransitive ones, is that we can take, this is the second part, and we can separate it from the verbal part. So according to lexical integrity, these phrasal verbs are not just one word, but rather two separate words that are called a phrasal verb. So they work together at some point to create meaning. And either you can say the information moves up in between them, or you could say that down moves back from the information behind the object. So Kelly wrote down the information versus Kelly wrote the information down. Both of them are fine. And this information about separating these two parts tells us that this is not a single word. This is two separate words, verb and particle. Now, there's a couple weird problems for lexical integrity, but they're not issues that we're going to concern ourselves with, but just things that we can think about. So the first problem with lexical integrity is that if morphology is happening first before syntax, how do we get these phrasal compounds? Like, it's a typical serial killers on the loose novel. Serial killers on the loose is a phrase that has been turned into a compound in this sentence. So if morphology happens first, then this, basically what we're saying is, it's gone through morphology to get serial killers on the loose. It's gone through syntax to put them together in that word order, and then it's gone through morphology again to form the compound. And according to lexical integrity, this is a little weird. So it's the same thing with a he's an I hear you but I don't care kind of guy. I mean, we have two sentences inside. We have a compound sentence here. I hear you and I don't care. And we're using that as a compound. So we think this is done in parallel now, so there might be some interaction back and forth, but the syntax only operates on a full word at some stage. So maybe this problem can be explained. But the second one is more interesting. So if syntax operates on full words, then agreement and gender and things like that should operate on full words. So the word my here has masculine gender. Husband is a word that has some morphemes attached to it, and sister is feminine. Now, my is a determiner, so it is going to agree with the gender of the noun. So this is supposed to be my husband's sister, so it should have the same gender as husband, because the determiner and the noun should agree. So, of course, oh, never mind, what's happening here? Well, husband somehow has become feminine. And somehow there's agreement here that should work. So, what's really happening is that the word husband itself, before any morphemes attached, is masculine. So somehow there's agreement happening between the determiner my and the root of the following word. So it's agreeing with the root instead of the entire word, which is what lexical integrity hypothesis said should happen. What should happen is my masculine should match with husband, which is masculine, but that's not happening. It's only agreeing with the root. So these are two interesting problems for lexical integrity, and of course most linguists still do believe that lexical integrity is, I wouldn't say correct, but this is what is being worked on right now and what tends to be agreed upon by most morphologists despite these two cases. So that is it on this lecture. It was a little bit more theoretical than the others because it really is a dive between the differences between morphology and syntax and how they interact. So for 30 minutes, I hope that was all right. If you have any questions, as always, you know how to contact me.